Hello, everyone. We want to welcome you to our webinar today. We are excited to have a few of our developers with us from Anovia Consulting. Joining us is Daniel Palmer, Valerie Ingersoll, and Dhruv Patel, and they're going to be presenting on troubleshooting from a developer's perspective. And I know you're all eager to get started with this presentation, so before I pass it over to our developers, I just want to let you know that we are recording this webinar as well as all of our webinars, and it will be posted to our on-demand webinar library for you to review again or share with anyone. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to type those into the questions box in the webinar control panel, and we will get them answered during our Q&A time at the end of our session. So now I'm going to pass it on over to Daniel to kick off our presentation.
Thank you very much, Angie. My name is Daniel Palmer. I am a development consultant on the service and support team with Anovia Consulting. I've been here for about 3 years now, maybe 3.5. And prior to that, I've been doing software development probably for about the last decade, academically, personally, and started nav developing at Anovia Consulting, and I joined the service and support team shortly thereafter, and I have been here ever since. Joining me is Valerie and Dhruv, so I will pass it along to Valerie to make her intro as well.
Yep. Hello, everyone. My name is Valerie Ingersoll. I've been with Anovia for about 17 years. It was formerly ABC Computers when I first started. I've been pretty much on the support team the whole time here, working as doing some development and then some AC work, but pretty much just doing support. And then I specialize kind of in EDI as well. So it's nice to meet everybody here, and I'll pass it on to Dhruv.
Hi, myself is Dhruv Patel. I've been in Anovia from last 1 year, I think, and I have about 20+ years development experience in Navisions. So mostly I work in most of all past Navision version to till now. I'm in support teams. So that's all. Passing to Daniel.
Alrighty, so let's jump into our next slide here. Wanted to start out just with the first thing we do. Developers, we often run into error messages, and a lot of them are easily tackleable. I say easy, but there are a lot of these that you can read and understand without a full kind of development understanding. And the first thing that I do is just break apart that error message and understand all the different things that it's actually saying. And so I have this color coded here. I have 2 of them side by side. And the first thing is to identify what the actual issue is. So looking at the one on the left here, this is a permissions error. I'm sure a lot of you have seen these. The issue is you don't have permissions on what the object type it tells you is table data. So you don't have permissions on this table data. It will tell you then which table. It's talking about warehouse item tracking line. So that is what we are having issues with. And finally, it will tell you what it needs to perform the action you're trying to do. So in this case, it's modify. You'll see these with read, write, modify. So there's a couple different types of permissions that you can use. I'll show a little bit more later on about how you can come up with appropriate permission sets for your users and track down all the required permissions. The second one here is an overflow error. I'm going to show you both of these, how we would tackle finding and fixing this issue. The overflow error is a little bit more detailed, but it's also pretty explanatory when you really look into it. So it says the contents of the description field cannot be copied to the description field because of the size. The description field is too small. So there are, and I've underlined these descriptions because these are actually fields on separate tables. And the information above is summarized in a little bit more technical way down below. So it's saying, on the right side, we have the sales header description field. That is the table field, and then the type is the description on the sales header is 50 characters long. The description on the sales invoice header is only 5 characters long. I created this situation for a demo. Hopefully you will not run into something quite this extreme. But the situation that we're running into here is the description on the sales header is a lot longer than the description on the invoice header. It just doesn't fit in there. So we'll run into overflow errors like this more commonly with modifications. You'll see them rarely in the base application. Typically, this will occur if if you want to increase the size of a, say you want to increase the size of the description on the sales header, just to allow your users to put more detail there, but you don't increase it on the invoice header. When you go to post this document, it's automatically going to take that description field and it's going to try and jam it into the sales invoice header's description field. And this is a custom field I created, so these two tables don't actually have a description on them natively. But what I did here was I created that 50 character text field and I just tried to jam it into the sales invoice header, and it didn't work, obviously. So breaking this one apart, the contents cannot be copied because the size is too small. That's all one thought. The description here and the description here is description copied to the description. So that's two different fields. And then it'll tell you, again, which one of these is too small, which one it's trying to take from and place into. So you can kind of see some of the issues there. So really what the point I'm trying to drive home here is make sure you really read these error messages and try and break them apart, because sometimes you'll see this message on the right here and it looks kind of crazy, but when you really get down to it and you break it apart and you try and understand the different pieces of it, it becomes a lot more readable, just parsing it apart. So the next thing I want to show you guys is the permissions recorder. And this will help to track down some of the issues that you'll run into with permissions. So let me switch my screen here. I'll show you guys monitor 3. And I mentioned the permission error, right? So you run into an issue. One of your users is trying to, say you created a new user, you hired somebody, created a new job, something like that. And you need to go through and see exactly what permissions a user would need to perform a task. I frequently have to handle fixing permission errors or finding out which permissions people need to go through with the process. And the best way to do that, especially if you have more than one permission you think you might need, you might get that first permission error. You don't have permission to modify this table. And then you fix that one and you run the same process. You might get another permission error on a different table. And you just kind of keep fixing issues and trying it and fixing another issue and try it again. And it's not a very efficient way of putting those permission sets together. So the way I like to do it is with this, it's called a permission recorder. And this was introduced in NAV 2017. and you can go, so if I go, I can edit an existing permission or I can create a new permission here. Note that you will need to be a super user to do this. You go to the permissions, go to actions here, and let me make it full screen so you can see it. We have this record permissions over here on the right. So I would come in as a super user just so I can complete a process start to finish without having to run into anything. I would start the permission recorder, go through with that user's process, whatever they need to do, whatever process your, call it the new employee needs to do. And then when you're finished with that, you go ahead and hit stop here, and it'll open up a window with all of your required permissions to do that activity. So that's the best way I think of resolving those permission errors, because it is something you're going to run into frequently, and fixing those quickly, efficiently is easy when you know how to do it. It's not something you need to get frustrated with or kind of, and it's definitely not something you want to do with an iterative process where you fix one permission error and you get another one and you fix that one and you get another one. It's just, you're going to run into all sorts of headaches. So I would definitely encourage you to use this record permissions tool.
I do have another comment if I can on permissions.
Yeah, definitely.
So if you're getting a permission error, it is possible too that it's a licensing issue. So, I mean, it could be that your nav license doesn't allow you to like write or modify to a certain table. And a good way of knowing that or figuring that out is if you have a super user, if a super user gets the same error, it's probably a licensing issue. Or another thing that I do sometimes is go into the object designer and the development client and run the table directly with the super user. And if you get a permission error when you run the table directly, it's probably a licensing thing. So
yeah, that's a great point. Just how we narrow that down a little bit, because that is the first thing thanks for bringing that up, because when you run into a permission error, that is the question: is it a permission error in nav, or is it something missing off the license?
Right. Yep.
So yeah, that's a great way to do it, is have a super user go in, try the process, and if it still doesn't work, it's almost certainly a licensing issue.
Yep.
All right, so let me go back to monitor 1, and we'll go to our next slide for our debugging tool. So I'm gonna go through debugging that second error. That would be the overflow error. The issue that we just resolved really easily solved, or most easily solved, through the permission recorder, or like Valerie said, try and get a little bit more context from just playing around with the super user, making sure you can run that process with the super user. In order to track down, so the overflow error did give us some good information, but I wanted to do a little demo on the debugger and show how that tool works, and then a little bit of information on how you use it. So for this situation, I'm going to trigger that same error that I was showing, that overflow error. So if I go to my sales orders, and it is 104013. So you can see here, this sales order has a bunch of test information in the description field. This is a 50-character field, and if I try and post this, I'm going to get this overflow error. So I already know what's causing this, but say I don't. I'm coming in totally blind, and I want to get a little bit more information on that error. So there's two ways you can access your debugger. The first is from the development environment, tools, debugger, debug session. So this is one way. It'll give me this message. You're about to connect, which is not your default connection. You click yes through this. It's really not your default connection, right? Because normally when you access this system, you're doing it through a different avenue. So click yes through that. It'll bring up your session list. I'm not debugging yet. Point it towards my session here. It'll give everyone's user IDs if you have a bunch of them. And one very important note, do not debug in live. It locks up tables. It will cause you all sorts of headaches, especially if you have users in the system, but even if you don't, if you have background processes running things on your job queue and you flip the debugger on, I could sit, I can sit in the middle of the sales order posting code all day and my debugger, like the code will not move. I will not release table locks. The debugger will just have every other session in there, unable to interact with certain tables. So just a pretty important note, try and always debug outside of production. So I'm going to go ahead and click debug here. And it brings up this screen, which doesn't do anything until you trigger an error or hit a breakpoint in code. So I'll give you a little bit more info on those breakpoints in a second, but let's start by triggering our error. So I'm going to go ahead and post this again, which, as we know, will cause an overflow error. And it has me kind of stuck up here. My debugger is flashing down below. So let's click on that, and I click it, shows me, hey, that's that same error I was getting. And we go ahead and say okay here, and it'll take me to the exact spot in code where that error occurs. And in this situation, it is when I'm trying to copy sales header fields into the sales invoice header. As we know, the description field on the sales header is 50 characters long. The description on the sales invoice header is 5 characters long. And that's something we already knew, but in this case, we're going to pretend like we didn't know that. You can see on the right side, it has the type text 50 and text 5 of those two. And these are what's called a watch. So when I'm debugging, if I want to keep a little bit of extra information off to the right, certain fields I want to pay more attention to, you can add a watch to them. So I did this before our demo, but the way I do that is clicking this variables button up here. It'll bring up all the different variables in the code at this point in time. And I can break them open and expand, see what all the fields on that sales invoice header are. So, in this situation, the error message we got here was pretty explanatory. It was saying, hey, this is an issue with the sales invoice header description and the sales header description. They don't match. But you're not always going to have that great information. Maybe it just gives you a vague error, and you don't even know, maybe you don't even know what sales order the issue is coming from. So you can debug it and break open these variables and see, oh, this is sales invoice 104013, and you can see any other info on here that you need. It's a really handy tool when you're coming through and just trying to get context about an issue, or especially trying to maybe track down where a value is coming from, things like that. It can help out a lot. So if I wanted to add a watch, say to the posting date, I can hit this, click on it, hit add watch. It doesn't look like it does anything until you hit close, at which point it'll add that here. One thing that I've run into is sometimes like when you're debugging and you already trigger an error. So when you saw the debugger come up here, it had the error message up on the screen. We already hit it. The error already occurred. And sometimes that can cause you to lose sight of local variables. So if you ever run into that situation where you're looking at your variables after an error occurs and it doesn't quite make sense, you do lose some visibility on local variables when an error occurs. So a way around that is I can put a breakpoint. I mentioned I was going to talk a little bit more about those. I can put a breakpoint before our error occurs and then step into and trigger the error. So I can see what all the information is prior to that error message coming up. I added a breakpoint there by hitting F9. There's also a button. Yeah, that was it. It's this toggle button here. We'll add a breakpoint, or you can add them directly from the development environment by hitting F9, or I think there's also a breakpoint button in here. Let me just go into an object here and take a peek. Debugger toggle breakpoint. So if you want to add in a breakpoint in code, you can toggle the breakpoint that way, or just hit F9 and it'll go away. So let me show you what that looks like. So I'm going to hit continue here, which will release my role tailored client. And we see this error message pop up here. So if I trigger that one more time, rather than the error coming up, the error occurs at this line, but I've stopped it. I put a breakpoint in, and we're before that error occurs. So you can step in, you can step in and trigger the error at this. It'll trigger if I click step into again. And then if you want to see, this is getting a little bit more in depth, but if you want to trace, this is called the call stack. If you want to trace it back and see how you got to this function call here, you can work your way back in code and you see, this calls insert invoice header, and then here is the insert invoice header function, and here's all the stuff it's doing at this point. So that's just a quick little demo on how to access the debugger. There is a lot you can do with this, and it is easy to get down, spiraling into a rabbit hole. So what I would recommend when you're using the debugger, it is useful when you have an error message that you want to get to the bottom of, if you have a specific error that you don't understand. So errors are excellent things to debug. If you're trying to debug something to understand a process, that is definitely getting a little bit more in depth. So I would encourage you to play around with it, but again, do not do it in production. And just note, there's a lot you can do with it. So if you're trying to understand errors and you're feeling a little adventurous, I would encourage you to try out the debugging tool.
And one more situation where I like to use a debugger too is like if a field is getting populated with something that I don't know how or when it is, I like to use a debugger and kind of step through and see what's causing it to set to whatever value it's being set to. It's handy in situations like that as well.
Yeah, that's a great point, and that goes hand in hand with these watches as well. So that situation, yeah, say you have a sales order that's ending up with a strange, or an invoice that's ending up with a strange value after posting, and it doesn't match what was on the sales order originally.
Right.
Yeah, you could come in and add, like, basically step through the whole posting process, and have a watch over on the side. And if you, I mentioned step into up here, the step over will avoid going into function calls. So like if I wanted to just, maybe I know something changes within this insert invoice header function. I don't know where it changes. for the sake of our discussion, let's pretend that this create campaign, this function right here, is modifying a value on the sales invoice header, and we either don't want it to do that or don't understand why it's doing that. But we don't necessarily know the issue comes about in this function. We just know that it is triggered somewhere within insert invoice header, that value gets set incorrectly. So what I could do is add a watch over on the right. And so, for example, we have, we can see our sales header description field here. And then I would there's these 3 buttons. I should give a little context on these 3. So step into would dive into so I'll go back a step. If I was on this line here and I clicked step into, the debugger would jump into this code here, and I could then step into each of these lines and kind of one by one go through them. Step over will skip, it'll still do the processing within insert invoice header, but the debugger won't dive into that, so I won't see it. So it saves you a little time if you know something is happening within insert invoice header. What we could do is add a watch on the right, and then just do a step over on everything, and it'll step over this line, it'll step over that line, it'll still run the processing code, and then the point at which we would be on this line in our hypothetical situation, this function is updating a value incorrectly. So we're stepping over all these. We don't really care what these functions are doing unless they update that value. So we don't want to spend all that time digging through them. So I'll just step over everything. And when I step over this line, I'm going to see that value update on the right. And so I know, yeah, that issue was introduced in this create campaign entry function. So that's a great point, Val. It can really help you understand where values came from. If you have something that doesn't really make sense, or you don't know where it came from.
Right. Yeah.
That will help.
Yep.
Great point. Alrighty, so let me pivot back here to my PowerPoint, and let's go in a slightly more general discussion. This is just a couple common errors that we see, things that we run into frequently. Some of these are more straightforward, some of them are a little bit more complex. And these are, I just wanted to talk through how we as developers will break into these error messages. I gave you some examples that were broken out in a little bit more detail. So let's start with the first one. Item tracking cannot be fully applied. So
yeah, so I can talk on that one if you'd like.
Yeah.
So one thing I want to point out in this one is it's kind of confusing because it says item tracking serial number, lat number, and there's actually a blank after serial number, but it's not always easy to see that. So sometimes we see that in error messages because on a lat tracking line, you can define either the serial number or the lat number. I think it's usually one or the other. But it's telling us here that on some document that we're trying to post, we tried to assign lat number 51321 for item 247310, and then also variant, but there's nothing after it, so I think it's saying variant of blank cannot be fully applied. So in this instance, a lat number was defined for an item on a document, but it's saying it cannot be fully applied. So that most likely means that there's not enough inventory on hand in that lat for that item to post that document. So this is one where I don't think I usually debug you might get some more information on debugging, but you already know which document you're trying to post. The error message is giving you the item number and the lot number. So what I would do in that instance is go like to the item card, look at the available on hand for that lot, like look at the, I'd usually look at the item ledger entries, warehouse entries. Sometimes I go directly into the table and filter on that item and on that lot, and then I like subtotal per bin if the database uses bins, and see if see how much is on hand and see what the document's trying to post. And sometimes I may see a difference between the item ledger entries and warehouse entries where there's something off. They should be in sync, but I've seen instances where they're not. So sometimes we need to deal with that. There's different ways of doing that. One is you can go into like the item journal and do a warehouse adjustment to get everything in sync. If that doesn't work, there has been instances where I'd have to go into the warehouse entry table and manipulate the data a little bit. It's not something we like to do, but sometimes it's required. And there's some instances too where the bin contents is just not showing a record for that item and that lot. So it's just a matter of adding that sometimes. So, or it could just be that there's not enough on hand and you need to do an adjustment to put more into that lot number for that item.
Right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, great explanation. I'm not sure I have anything to add to that one myself. How about you, Drew?
Yeah, it's depend on the situation. It's not always we just go and check means that item ledger. It's depend on which document and from where the error is coming. Yeah, it's depend on that we just check the things. Yeah.
Yep.
Right. All right, let's move on to our next one here. We'll go left to right, top to bottom. How about that? So we're going to take a look at the sales account must have a value in the general posting setup. The general business posting group is WH. The product posting group is KC, cannot be 0 or empty. So this one could come from a couple different places. Let's, for the sake of argument, say it came out of a sales order. So this is not, not necessarily going to be on the same document you're looking at. You could be, so the sales account must have a value. You might not even be looking at a sales account. You might be looking at a sales order or something like that. So the first thing you need to do is find that sales account, and it tells you the keys of that record, or excuse me, the general posting setup. So the general posting setup is missing a sales account. I'm sorry, I read that backwards.
Yeah, so sales account would be the field. I'm sorry. Like if you go to general posting setup, sales account is one of the columns where you need to make sure that there's a GL account listed in that sales account field for the combination of WH and KC.
Yeah, I think this error is like, it's required some more knowledge about the systems, because this is like setup related error. It's not like programming error or some user get like frequently. Once it's setups, no one get the error. So this is like if the customer is setups, but posting group combination is not in place, then everyone gets this error. Once it fixed, means it's fixed for all users. So it requires some additional knowledge of the setups, customer setups.
That's a good point. Yeah, this is more of a setup error than it is an error that you would debug. That's true. And yeah, once you define it for this combination, nobody else should get the error. You might get another one for a different general business posting group or a different general product posting group. But yeah, it's all pretty much setup stuff. So
yeah, great point. That is, setup specific, and once you get past it, I'd probably, you know, I would run into this, and I might not be sure what that sales account should be. Maybe I know, but maybe I don't. And you know, that would be worth doing your due diligence to find out what account is correct there. So it's not, you know, you don't want to just put something in there to get past the issue. Like Drew was
Oh,
saying,
right, right, yeah.
have a full understanding of what you're putting in there.
Yeah, it might be something that needs to be handed off to the finance department to put
Right.
what it needs to be.
Right.
Yeah,
Because if you use a wrong account, then it will post all the things into that account, and that may be not right for the finance department, right? So yeah, I think
right.
this is not something to user fix. I think this is something to fix by your finance department or something who knows what should goes into that combination.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, completely agree. Alrighty, let's go down to our bottom left here. Document date must have a value in sales header. Document type equals order, number equals EDI15 ... It cannot be 0 or empty. So this one is a bit more apparent than some of these other ones. This can occur if you're on a sales order. You try and post it or release it, and you get these errors. Document date must have a value. These pop up all over the system, and it's not sales header specific. Really just telling you, hey, you need a value in this field. It's required. You can't ignore that. And it'll give you the table information. So in this situation, it says must have a value in sales header, document type order, number is that EDI number. So the sales header represents unposted sales invoices. It represents sales orders, sales quotes. Those all use the same table. So that document type in this one is particularly important, just because that sales header could be any type of document, really. Any type of sales document. When it gets posted, it does convert it. As you saw during my debugging, it'll convert it into a sales invoice header. But until you post it, it is a sales header, document type of invoice or order or quote. So you know, a lot of times you would get this if you're on a sales order and you try and post it and you're missing that value, but sometimes you might be on a different document, and like you could try and post the sales order and maybe it's yelling at you about a warehouse document. So in those situations, it's more important to really understand, you know, which table is it talking about, which record in that table is it talking about, and that'll let you track down where to put that value in.
Right. Yeah, and these are the like mandatory fields, like certain process need certain field and certain value should be there. So this is like error that's okay. Means if the mandatory field is blank, then it's throw the error because those processes require the values in those fields. Sometimes, yeah, I notice like for one or two clients, like even the document date is there on that order, even, means it's through the error. So like in that case, maybe there are some customization in the place. So before that process that they are releasing order or they are posting order, something in a place or some custom code is there that clear out those fields, and that's why through the error. So it means like if we check the documents, the date is there, but during the process, that value is cleared out because of some custom code. So in that case, like we have to debug, okay, what is and where it's clear out the values.
Yeah, great point. And then we would do kind of Val's description of debugging to see where that value gets updated. That would be a good technique. If you do think that document date's populated and you're still getting this error, probably a good candidate for debugging.
Right.
So what do you guys think about number 4? You must specify lot number in that warehouse activity line.
So that one would actually be given from like a warehouse pick, because the table for a warehouse pick page would be the warehouse activity line. So this message is just telling us that we need to define a lot number for this item, which would be the P number, I believe. So from the warehouse pick, you would go into that item line and then drill into that, I think with like the line button, and go into item tracking lines, and then you'd need to define a lot number. So that's pretty much what this message is telling us.
Right.
Yeah.
And this error does look a little bit different. That's just because this is a screenshot from a classic client, but this is still an error.
Well, and actually, I think that the P number might be the pick number. And looking at this some more, I think it might not be giving us the item number. I think it might be. I'm not positive.
I think you're right about that.
Okay, and then the line number is 10,000. So the lines are numbered by 10,000s usually on documents. So that's probably the first line on the pick. So it'd probably be 10,000. The next line would be 20,000. But usually you don't see the line number. So if you don't know which line it is, you can always zoom the line or view all the fields, and then that'll give you the line number information so that you know which line it is you need to go to define the lot number.
Right. And what if I have one of these error messages that just says line number equals 0 or line number is blank? What would that typically tell me?
That usually is when it's trying to post a line that the system created. Like, so if you're trying to post a document like a sales order, sometimes it posts like a sales journal entry or a general journal entry in the interim. So it creates this other line, but it doesn't give it a line number, because it's just kind of like it's there temporarily until it posts it. So those are kind of harder to debug, because you don't, once the error is gone and you go to that document, you're not going to see it. It's something that's created in the code, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. And once you get the error, unless that's been written to the table, it's just going to go out the window. And
right. Yeah, because it's not committed. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So that one, if it gives you a line number that's blank, it's worth poking around and seeing if you can understand it, but those can definitely get more in depth and a little trickier. So just something to be aware of on that front.
All right.
All right, well, that wraps up our scheduled discussion here. At this point, I would like to turn it over and see if we have any questions here.
Thank you, everyone. We do have a couple of questions that came through. If anyone has any additional questions, please go ahead and get those into the questions box and we can get them answered for you. The first one is, can anybody use the nav debugger?
I'll take that one. If you have super permissions, you should be able to use the nav debugger. And actually, I mentioned I was going to show a second way to access that debugger. Let me show that real quick. I alluded to it, and I think I just skipped over it. So if you want to access the debugger and you do not have access to the development environment, if you are a super user, that's really the main key here. You can type in sessions, open that up, and it'll start you on this same screen that I accessed through the development environment. So you don't even need access to the development environment. You just need to be a super user, and you'll be able to debug if you have super permissions.
Okay, thank you. And then the next question is, I often get an error message when I am posting a sales order, but then the document says that it still posts. How come I get that?
I can take that one. I sometimes get those support tickets where like it's airing out, but then the sales document still posts, and it's usually, I think the error is usually more like it's trying to print a report. Like let's say it's trying to post a sales order, but then the error message says you don't have permission to print this report or something like that. So it is possible that the sales order could still be posted and then it's committed. There would be a commit in the code, so that finishes and commits. But then when that process is done, it's trying to do something else like print a report or maybe send out the manifest for UPS or something that's outside of the process where it errors out. So it is possible that you could get an error message, but part of the process does still complete. So, and errors like that are harder to figure out sometimes because now the sales order posted. So now you can't go back into that sales order and debug it and recreate the situation unless you get it every time that you post. Sometimes it's only like on certain ones, and that certain scenario might be hard to determine what that is. It might be a specific scenario.
Right. Yeah, and a lot of times if I run into those, you can do the copy document as well to create a little bit more data to test with.
Oh, right, that's a good point. Yep.
Those do get to be a headache if you're trying to recreate the same issue, and every time you try and trigger it, it posts the order.
Right.
I've run into my fair share of those.
All right, well, I believe those are all the questions that we have for you guys today. If anybody has any additional questions, please feel free to contact us, or if you would like to contact your account manager, please do that and we will get those addressed for you.
Awesome. Thank you guys very much for watching.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us. And if you're watching on demand, we thank you for taking the time out and watching this webinar with our developers. We do have more webinars coming up. Can you believe it's going to be November next week? This year has gone by so fast. Next week, we have Ross Bottorff from Anovia Consulting, and he's going to be presenting on how to create and use a Business Central API. So check out our website for more of our upcoming events, and that's anovia.com/events. Oh, have you heard our podcast yet? It's called the Anovia Conversation, and we just want to encourage you to listen to our selection that our hosts, Steve Waltz and Jeff Progolski, have provided to us. And you can find out about all the different podcast platforms to listen to on our podcast page, and that's anovia.com/podcast. So check out our selection and subscribe so you'll be notified when those new episodes air. All right, well, we thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you soon on another Anovia webinar. Have a great week, everyone.